Welcome everyone. Recently, Christian Prince uploaded a video with a German-speaking Abdul. The Abdul in this case was talking about 2 Kings chapter 2.
Da kamen zwei Bären. Bären.
What I want to do in this video was take you through the passage itself in 2 Kings chapter 2. And we're going to see what's going on there. We're going to use an article from the JBL, just go point by point through it. Journal of Biblical Literature. It's an article by a scholar there, last name BURNETT. It's a technical article, but we spend a lot of time on this channel adapting technical material for a YouTube audience, so you don't have to wade through all of the complex literature. You can just watch the video. It's a lot less work that way. So let's begin with reading a couple of verses right from 2 Kings chapter 2. This will give us the core of the whole bears and the boys story, and then we'll get into it. Elisha went up from there to Bethel, and while he was going up on the way, some small boys came out of the city and jeered at him, saying, "Go up, you bald head! Go up, you bald head!" And he turned around, and when he saw them, he cursed them in the name of the Lord. And 2 she-bears came out of the woods and tore 42 of the boys. From there he went on to Mount Carmel, and from there he returned to Samaria. Now, believe it or not, the difficulty with this passage begins way back in 2 Kings chapter 2. So they, referring to Elijah and Elisha, went down to Bethel. Now, the problem is that this isn't possible. It's not possible to go down to Bethel because Bethel is higher in elevation. BURNETT writes, the statement in 2 Kings 2:2 that Elijah and Elisha went down from Gilgal to Bethel has long puzzled interpreters. And he mentions there that some have suggested another Gilgal, and then others will just ignore the directional difficulty. However, BURNETT goes on to note how accurate the geography is elsewhere throughout this period in the Hebrew Bible. He refers to a decisive concern for geography in this passage. Not only do all the place names mentioned in this text correspond to known historical geography, but they also play significant roles elsewhere. So it's not only that the geography in general is extremely accurate, but Bethel itself is a very significant place. BURNETT says the theological geography of these books, and that's a phrase that we're going to interface with later on as we continue this study, reserves a special place of scorn for Bethel. So Bethel is a significant place. It's well known. It doesn't have a good reputation at this point. It's not just some small out-of-the-way village that could easily be mistaken for something else. So let's summarize the issues so far. The geography is very accurate with the possible exception of this puzzling statement about going down to Bethel. The passage itself indicates a focus toward geography. So geography, and he mentioned theological geography, plays a big part in the narrative. Bethel is very well known. However, the statement about going down to Bethel is topographically incorrect. So he set up the issues that we're facing here, that interpreters are facing, and then he's going to address each of them in turn. BURNETT's going to draw attention to literary patterns operative in 2 Kings chapter 2, which clarifies not only the ostensible topographical oddity, but also resolves other difficulties of interpretation in this passage, such as our boys and the bears story. He describes some of the literary patterns he's talking about. Commentators on this passage have recognized various aspects of a collection of narrative elements centering on Elisha's status as Elijah's successor. So we won't talk a lot about this, but it's something very important to keep in mind, the succession of Elijah and Elisha there. The way the narrative ties these two together, ties them both back to Yahweh, to the God of Israel. And so they're both true prophets of Israel, and in order to emphasize this, the narrative emphasizes Elisha's connection back to his predecessor, Elijah. With respect to the narrative elements, among them, BURNETT notes a polarity of up-down language throughout the passage. These merit special attention in determining the significance of going down to Bethel. Now back to this notion of theological geography. BURNETT's going to explain how this directional language, this up-down language, can be theologically symbolic in nature. He says that Bethel figures prominently as a sanctuary site in the central hills to which worshipers and other travelers are said to go up. Thus, the mention of going down to Bethel from Gilgal or almost anywhere else calls for considering this directional language in relation to symbolic meaning at work in this passage and its broader literary context. Now, what kind of symbolism would be at work with this place called Bethel? Well, Burnett clarifies. Bethel is uniquely emblematic of disobedience to Israel's God. Bethel thus occupies a special place of scorn in the sacred geography of the DH, and that is the Deuteronomistic period from Deuteronomy through 2 Kings. Given Bethel's role therein as an archetype of apostasy, one would expect some uneasiness with the cities mentioned in 2 Kings 2. That is exactly what the text shows. Now, with this background, let's get into the bear's story and see how all of this ties together. 2 Kings 2:23, he went up from there to Bethel, and while he was going on the way, some small boys came out of the city. The significance of this grisly episode comes into focus with some attention to the expression Na'arim Ketanim. The traditional interpretation that the males thus denoted are children derives from a literal translation of the phrase. On the other hand, Genesis 37:2 describes Joseph as a Na'ar at the age of 17. Solomon, at the beginning of his rule, calls himself a Na'ar Katon. Hadad the Edomite is a Na'ar Katon when Yahweh raises him up as an adversary against Solomon, and he escapes to Egypt, where he marries the Pharaoh's sister-in-law. So let's jump down to 1 Kings 3:7. And now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of David, my father, although I am but a little child. And the phrase here is the same, these two words, Na'ar Katon, the same two Hebrew lemmas. So Burnett concludes the term Na'ar is applied to an unmarried male who has not yet become the head of a household. In other words, it doesn't have to be translated youths or little boys or small children or something of that sort. The same term, by the way, is also used of David when he goes to fight Goliath. Now, there's another term we need to look at in this passage, and this would be the Yaladim in verse 24, which at first glance would also seem to indicate that these lads are children. On the other hand, the same term is used in 1 Kings 12 as a sole designation for Rehoboam's younger advisors. In the DH, once again, Deuteronomic history period from Deuteronomy through 2 Kings, and elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, these terms are used to designate young adult males, usually with royal associations. Far from being little children, these males are young men of the royal and perhaps priestly establishment at Bethel. Now, there's even more symbolism at work here in 2 Kings chapter 2. Against this group of young men, Elisha pronounces a fatal curse in the name of Yahweh. The number of them killed, 42, is also the number of young men of Judean royalty. 42 figures regularly in the Hebrew Bible and ancient Near East as a symbolic number of potential blessing or curse. So there's even more symbolism than we originally thought, even with the number 42. Now, remember we talked about the continuity between Elijah and Elisha. Now, this narrative, that the attack that the boys launch on Elisha, it's kind of a comical way as we read it of severing the connection between Elisha and Elijah. In other words, they want to distance Elisha from his predecessor, and in doing so, distance Elisha from the God of Israel. Now, as I said, it comes across in a rather humorous way, but let's see what Burnett says. In addressing the prophet, they call him Baldy. Among the various possibilities suggested for the name-calling's precise nuance is that it involves a contrast to the description of Elijah, a contrast that suggests a challenge to Elisha's authority. In any case, it is a sharp contrast to Elisha's reception by the sons of the prophets from Jericho, who declare before the prophet, the spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha. And now Burnett is going to combine everything that we've learned, the symbolic language, the directional language going up, going down, the Hebrew lemmas that we looked at for the youths, the Na'ar Katon. He's going to combine all of this into sort of a concise summary explanation. As part of the reproachful speech of the boys of Bethel, the word to Elisha to go up plays as a mocking admonition against his legitimacy as Yahweh's prophet. Those who find themselves cursed by Yahweh are those who call for the prophet to go up to Bethel, language that elsewhere refers to worship at the sanctuary site. In sum, those who suffer Elisha's curse and die in 2 Kings 2 are not children but a group of young adult males connected with the royal sanctuary of Bethel, who offer reproach rather than recognition of Elisha's mission as Yahweh's prophet and to call for the prophet to worship at Bethel. So it turns out that these so-called young boys are actually pagan priests who, with their physical descriptions of Elisha, try to sever him from his connection to Elijah and from his connection to the God of Israel. They try to seduce this prophet of Israel away from Yahweh into pagan worship at their high place. Elisha doesn't take too kindly to this. He curses these young lads, and Yahweh honors his curse and executes them for their attempt to lure the prophet of Israel into idolatrous worship. Thanks for watching.